Great, perfect. Let me just make sure I'm all squared away. Thank you guys. Sasha, that was a really great session. I just was, as you're going through that, just thinking about how this platform has changed so much. It is 2024, and Microsoft finally has forced the MFA, right? That was one of the last questions. And I think that's really important to talk about is that sometimes this discomfort, whether it's for the organization, for the admins or an admin, for users to implement a technology, they have right implications. So I'm glad that they're forcing it, whether it's Microsoft's MFA or another MFA, right? That's used to kind of over the umbrella. Um, so so Sasha, thank you again. My name is Vanessa Toves. I am by trade, right, a Microsoft 365 solutions architect. So I've worked with Microsoft's enterprise technology since like the very first version of SharePoint and their whole BI suite, all the way up into as the world has progressed with Microsoft into the cloud, right, into Azure. And I have, I think it's been now 4 years exactly. 4 years ago, I stepped into the very first role away from a lot of the day-to-day architecture and work for a company called Druva, which is data protection. Mainly because of what I was seeing, right? I was bringing so many of my customers to 365, and I was so surprised about the different mentality that I was facing with a lot of organizations. These are organizations large and small, about the configuration, about the implementation of any type of compliance or any type of security. I mean, and even just the features alone have changed so much now, right? There's so many more options within a license, right? To what you're licensed with. So I made this transition because this is where I felt compelled, right? In so much investment is going into Microsoft beyond the license, right? This is also the FTE's U, right? The engineering, migrating old archaic applications and utilizing this awesome platform. So I might reference a few things in here about Druva just because of this is where I'm at, right? I'm on this path of talking about data security and where does that work, and especially with this NIST framework. Now, the NIST framework, I will get into that more, but you know, this conversation that has to happen. I'm so grateful for very focused conferences around compliance and security because organizations and admins need to have these insight into understanding what's going on. So we'll get going here. If you don't read the digital defense report, right? There's the executive summary. There's a more detailed one. I'm probably like one of only a few people I know that's read that detailed one. But it's a report that's come out every year. And it really talks about the ecosystem, the threats to the ecosystem, the trends and the patterns. And you have to think that these trends and these patterns that Microsoft is referencing and using are coming from their information, their customer base, right? So in the last 4 years, the messaging is changing. The threats are different. Like the threat last year, where it was like 99% of all backup companies that were on-prem were always a target. And that threat's still there. But these new threats that are occurring, the new trends, you need to know what those trends mean to you and to your data. And you have to know what these options are. And when we're talking about the NIST framework, it really is just it kind of interesting. It's voluntary, but very much so like how MFA was voluntary for many years and now it's mandatory. Um, it's a guide, right? It's going to help you understand this framework about how to protect your data, how to manage and reduce like the um, cybersecurity risk, right? I'm not going to get into really the details of it. What I'm trying to do is kind of lay a foundation of what we're going to talk about that, and then really uh, towards the middle of this, I'm going to just tie in the actual attacks that occur. So when we're breaking out this framework, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, govern. Not only are there different aspects of this, and and unfortunately, the smaller the company, the more these things are going to be fewer people that are involved. Right? When you're dealing with, as a company begins to grow, or mid-size or large and enterprise customers or companies are, you might have more people, right? Different people that are responsible for the recover aspect. Different people that are responsible for configuring your XDR, right, your SOAR and SIM, in the protect or the detect portion of this framework. So there's so much, just as today, there's so much in 365 that you can configure. As a professional in this space, I could stay on the front end of working with customers, building and architecting solutions, doing requirements, right? Even building and developing, or you can switch to the back end, because you can spend your entire days on the back end and the configuration and the support of it. Right. So, um, even though you're a small company, even though you might have fewer people, I, I think you more than anyone else, of course, you know just how much work this is, right, to actually implement or utilize any kind of formal framework. Now, from an incident response perspective, what you have to also consider is the smaller the organization, once again, and the fewer people that are going to be in incident response. We have, for us, in the data protection, we work with customers that deal with incident response, of course, the incident response team. And what I know is they are looking for answers, evidence, and actions. So not all of you will be formal in an incident response, because there's sometimes, smaller the organization, there's just not enough time. But know that this is what is being talked about, right? This is the type of thing that it's not just this NIST framework, but it's also in a very formal or informal manner of what are we going to do in case something happens, right? What are we dealing with? What's our exposure? What if are we dealing with exfiltrations? Are we dealing with encryptions? Right. So and then now, as you go through, and much of that whole part of what you're going to deal with in terms of the incident response and your incident response workflows, probably dependent upon what your organization is already doing. What if you don't know, and you are tasked with the management and the architecture, the everything of Microsoft 365 and data underneath, that's a very dangerous situation to be in. So if you do not have an incident response, if you're not aware of what that plan is and what your role is, you must raise your hand. You must get involved, because it's better to be proactive in all of these than it is to be sitting there, right? And I don't know why I didn't have this built out already. So the ransomware in this case, you can get to the cleanup and recovery in generally one of two ways, right? Is through this incident response, executing potentially recovery, uh, or you're going to decrypt that data, get the code, pay that, right? So when we're working with customers, what we know is this thing playing out over day 1 of 7. You're dealing with more than just a data loss. So like I work for a data protection company, data security company. Um, And it's more than just, I need to recover my data now. It is. Or you have identity attacks, and that could be a systemic identity attack. And if you don't know what a systemic identity attack is, you need to Google it, because also Microsoft has a very specific protocol to if you are going through and dealing with a systemic identity attack, right? So part of that incident response workflow is for you to know generally what is going to occur, right? As you're stepping, like I said, it doesn't matter the size. These steps, and especially if you have like cyber insurance, right? If you have cyber insurance wants to. They've asked so many questions. I was just on a webinar. Every once in a while, I like to just listen to different perspectives. I was on a webinar that really talked about the detailed application process for cyber insurance. And I'm like, I did not even realize just how in depth that was. But they're going to want to know these things. What plays in. Where are you? What did I do to have first determined that a breach has been confirmed? What's involved with incident analysis, and what do I need to have collected that information? Right, so there's only a handful of slides in here that we're going to break this out. But in this threat monitoring, and then you've heard, right, we've got in the ecosystem of Microsoft, right, you've got the purview for primarily your compliance, right, and defender and secure. So there's so many features. So with that and so many features, and if all of our eggs are in the Microsoft basket, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, it's right. It doesn't matter, honestly, who is providing your MFA, just as long as you have MFA. So if it's Okta, if it's Microsoft, awesome. But you must know what your organization is going to do if you hit this part, if you hit an incident, and what are you going to get? Where are you going to get this information? Right? What does it mean to, you've got so many different SIM and SOAR application, not so many. You have a SIM and SOAR, you have XDR, right? EDR, and all of these alerts, even alerts that come out of our data protection, there's alerts everywhere now, right? If you're involved in this and any of the data, right, any of these applications that your organization has invested in, you really need to be part of have an understanding of where they're getting that, because that's part of this. Okay, an alert has fired where on 365 data, whether it's email or OneDrive or a laptop desktop, whether it's something has occurred, right? How does that trickle down and into the data that you're responsible for under, right, or the platform under Microsoft 365? How do I know it was a false positive? Right? So we have to elevate our knowledge now. I'm no longer, I stopped being just a solutions architect to build knowledge management platforms or to replace, this old green screen application and with Power Apps and Power Automate and all those things. I stopped being just that once Microsoft went to 365, of course, because now security is a much different thing. So it's everybody's business to be part of the security of Microsoft 365. You may not be part of the InfoSec team, but you have that security responsibility. And when you're getting into and talking about, if you're very formal in your organization and you find out that you have an incident response team, you're going to want to know, okay, well, you're going to ask of me this information to help determine whether or not we have a breach, whether or not we have an incident for us to continue on this whole workflow. Right? Now comes the part of where you're going to find this information. How do you know? How do you know how to scan for something? How do you know now that we've confirmed this breach? Now we're going to go into this parallel world of this scope and containment and recovery and remediation and forensics, because the last three, for you to be prepared for what's going to happen, is that if this is not a serial thing, like there's no necessarily start and end and we're done. You've got from the scope and containment, after this breach is confirmed, you're cycling through this. And that security team, right, or even the team that your cyber insurance brings in for you to help you deal with this incident, you're going to be going through these parallel aspects of scope and containment recovery, because maybe you have affected users in OneDrive, and maybe you have affected data in SharePoint, and maybe you have affected data in Exchange. And so it's not a start and it's not a stop. And so understand, kind of like, as part of that incident and the scope and containment, what are we doing? All right, we're basically trying to, we've already determined we definitely have something. We have a breach, we have a compromised credential, and that they could have been in there for weeks, for months, as we've all heard about that, right? So now you're trying to figure out what the hell, I need to stop this from spreading, and this is where different parts of your team, if you are lucky enough to be part of a larger organization, or even a company that values an incident response team, you're not alone in that. And you're just now waiting for your part, right? The laptop, desktop team, the end user data team, they've gone through theirs. They're there. Now you're sitting there trying to say, how do I even know if something is affected in 365? Where am I going to get that information? And so being part, the benefit of an incident response team, awesome. You being part of that team, that means you need to be prepared for where you're going to get some of this information. What is involved, right, in the recovery and remediation. Now, Microsoft just finally released a product, right? It's kind of a series of products that finally kind of have this enterprise backup of, the core data. So the core data that 95% of your data is in Exchange, OneDrive, and SharePoint. That's like where the bulk of your data is in 365. The rest is metadata, to be perfectly honest. And so they finally have this backup product, which is great. I mean, I'm glad they're making that investment. And now backup is one of the 5 foundational principles of security, right, for Microsoft. That's coming out of their digital defense report. So just like it's taken them years to talk about the value, of saying we need to enable this 100% MFA. Okay, now we understand that we very well may not have the ability to natively recover from an incident, recover from a deletion effect, or recover from a ransomware that's encrypted all of our OneDrives, right? So knowing what is involved in the recovery and remediation, as you're sitting in a security and this meeting, preparing and listening to everyone else, you need to understand, like, how, and challenge that team. Well, what about Microsoft 365? You guys are backing up your VMs, you're backing up SQL Server, you're backing up all of these things, you're doing all of that. What about my data? Right? Because as a solutions architect, this is the part too where what you're building and what you're doing, there's that investment in the license, that investment in, you finally got your company to pay for a migration tool, and you finally moved. And that investment right there and also involved a lot of training that you created, maybe you and your team had to do to ensure that the users actually were able to easily adopt or transition to this new platform. And every problem you're solving, right, with your architecture of any solutions, I've made so many solutions. And on the other side of that are people. And once those people are involved, and if that data cannot be recovered, and we have transitioned so many business processes over and into Microsoft 365, and we cannot recover from that, right? This is where the pain begins. It's not just loss of time, but it literally could be a loss of revenue or even a fine on the other side if I am that process that I've transitioned into here. How are we going to recover? Challenge your team, your incident response team to be able to say, all right, I see that what we're doing. I see what we're doing. We're going to be able to recover this and recover that, right? Um, Now, after that phase, you've got this forensic and notifications. What occurred? This was the really interesting thing about the cyber insurance. The cyber insurance, um, the team, the incident response team that they send in is to do a lot of this, right? Get through the scope and containment, get through a company through recovery and remediation. But there needs to be a validation for them at the end of that to say that there's no other compromise in there. So now in your world of 365, in all of these configuration and all of these alerts, you need to be able to say, we're good. And that's a very hard thing to do, right? Don't be the ones waiting. Know what you're going to be asked of during this workflow. What will they need? Be prepared to know what you're going to get. And if by chance the organization is saying in our incident response, in our incident response plan, right? Here's what our workflow is going to be. We need X, Y, and Z, and you know that you actually don't have the right license for it, then you must say it now, right? You tell them now, I am not licensed for that. If we had this next, an E5, a whatever license, or maybe your recommendation would be to go and get a third party, this or that, whether it's security or third party compliance, right? Third party backup. And you want that. You have the ability to say, you have given me this requirement to ensure that during the recovery and remediation, because of our incident response workflow, you need to be able to recover this data, and we do not have that capability, right? So know what you're going to be asked for, because this is the life, like years. It's taken organizations years to not just move to 365, but begin to adopt. I mean, Sasha was talking about a lot of the configurations, right, with conditional access policy, with any of that. I mean, it takes so long. So whether you you just moved all your data into 365, or you're considering it and you're here wondering, what have we gotten ourselves into? We want to move over from Google, which is still a great idea, by the way. Um, you know, and it's going to take you years to adopt these things, and that's this part of that investment. All right, so now let's kind of talk about Microsoft, right? Well, Microsoft is saying in that digital defense report, um, the first, right, the top, there's a top three in terms of compromise, right? The compromise of laptop, desk, right, endpoint, compromise of credential, like those are the keys. How did the compromise occur? And what I was finding very interesting was, what these MFA fatigue attempts were. So here we are in July, I think of this year, or June, or I think it was July, was when the MFA was forced. And that's because now, and here we still have, what the hell is the MFA fatigue attempts? And there's millions of transactions under each and every one of these. And you have to think about this MFA fatigue attempt. This is not just Microsoft, right? Okta has its own. If you're using other identity providers, right, to manage your MFA, manage your user, and you're dealing with, right, in the world of the NIST framework, right? And this is like, it's so interesting. Like when you think about what you're doing already, maybe you're already doing some of these things that are part of that NIST framework. But we're trying to also then turn around and flesh out the gaps of what are we missing. So when we talk about fatigue attempts, when we talk about adversary in the middle, and you're wondering how the hell could we have had a compromise? We've done so much, and what occurs during this, that it's still happening. That's why it was forced. Right? This stuff and the data that you read year over year, the fact that 60% of attacks are human operated, but that's an increase 200% year over year. Know what is occurring uh, because this is where the pain of not doing something, right? No, whether you're reading and watching any of the other webinars, go into things like this, awesome, but you need to know why you need to do something. And you need to be able to turn around and tell your organization and your security team, hey, here's the thing, we've got SSO enabled and we've had a compromise. I want to know how we're going to be able to, protect Microsoft 365 SharePoint data. I mean, let's just be so isolated, right? To talk about that data. What are we going to do? If this occurred in Microsoft, what's going to occur? What's going to happen? Where could that come from? Okay, the compromise could have started on the endpoint within my network, and that moved into the cloud. The compromise could have actually come from an account or even a token and had gained access down, right? You need to know what these barriers, where these lines are, and where are we putting these barriers to stop this cross and if you've got the food allergy, like cross contamination, right? For the top attack vectors for 365, those are things like federated trust, account synchronization, and admin accounts. It doesn't matter if it's not just a global admin account, elevated accounts, right? And with the integrations of what everyone loves, all of these, everything's integrated. Nope, if you don't do SSO, we don't really want it. Now, we have, for Druva, for our backup data protection, we give our customers options. Yes, you can use SSO. If you're doing the self-service recovery, absolutely. I mean, your users can use their SSO. You have a completely different configuration option that you can have for your admins. Yes, you can use SSO for admins, but here's the thing. If that admin account, it's all about accounts with access, right? If you're dealing with a systemic identity attack and that account has come in and it now has access to all of these things. Last year, ServiceNow, you saw an uptick in exfiltrations out of ServiceNow. Even with Druva, right? If you have an account with access, doesn't matter how that compromise occurred, whether it started with someone clicking the wrong link and some malware was installed on a machine that was very quiet. And all it did was listen. And it tried to do a couple of things. It tried to find out any possible way to get domain credentials. And then once it did, it had this quiet, right? It started its path and it began to exfiltrate. It began to encrypt. It began to delete. It began to lock out all of your admins. Doesn't matter how it occurred, the mechanism of compromise of credential. But even with that compromise of credential, you have to with just understand the impact. You only have to go look at the enterprise applications that are attached in your Azure to see exactly what is hooked and dependent upon your account, right? The account. So Sasha talked about a lot of these things. And I'm not going to get into all the details of the same stuff he is, but I believe 100% you have to have dedicated accounts for services. Even your applications, your big applications that are internal. The main reason is you must be able to isolate activity, right? In this workflow, in your incident response workflow, in trying to help determine, are we experiencing an incident? Is this an actual incident or is this a false positive? You must know that Druva, it has a specific account. It has a specific purpose. It was configured with very specifically with only access via the IP range, these certain IP ranges, right? But that's done. You also must be able to say, okay, I need to audit. This is why administration of 365 and their Azure, the Azure world, is very time consuming and now should be. right? As most organizations have like individuals that are dedicated to it. Creating alert policies. Alert policies have been in place as long as the MFA offering has in for Microsoft. It was very, very telling to me. It was like one of the first areas where when as a consultant, I would go in and I would create an alert policy on the account that they gave me. Right, here comes this consultant, and yes, because of who I am, I'm not going to do anything. Right, I've got my own integrity, but they gave me the keys by giving me a global admin, and I wanted to show them, hey, you guys should really know what the hell I'm doing in here, right? So creating an alert policy. So you can create an alert policy. Why dedicated accounts? Because the account that was used to configure data protection for Microsoft 365 should not be logging in to and creating a mail forwarding rule. You should audit these permissions, right? Sometimes applications have auto updating. And for our applications, their purpose. An admin, right, has to visually understand and see what permissions are being applied to that app, that enterprise app. Because if you know what accounts, Druva's account, great. That account should not be logging in from Australia. That's part of this incident. Right? So if you're thinking about that incident response and the incident analysis to first determine if you are actually dealing with, is this potentially a breach? You must have the infrastructure in place and the auditing in place to help you answer those questions. So this is why you must be part of the incident response team, and you must know what the security team is going to do to determine what are they going to look for, because you can put in, you can build your own policy to say any third party must have, as painful as it is, a separate account. Druva, from a back-end perspective on a day-to-day basis, we don't require elevated permissions. So, and I can isolate what it can do in a conditional access policy. So I'm like, this is part of like one of the reasons why I also, went to work for Druva. Wasn't just about backup, but I know the platform and I know what I can and can't do and what we should and should not be doing. Right? Even with Purview and with Defender, with any of these, your retention. The question someone asked in the last session was, what are your opinions on retention? To be honest, that's a question that your organization needs to answer. Your legal team needs to answer. It should be driven. No configuration of within Purview, within the Defender world, should be implemented unless there is an associated business policy, right? Retention is a mechanism of implementing a policy that your organization stated. I mean, I've seen, companies manage it in one document that says, we retain all project files for this long. We retain all emails for this long. Oh, but we retain executive emails and board member emails for this long. The purview and what you configure must and should be driven by policies of the organization. And if there are no policies, you need to go and make sure that someone else is writing that. Because as an administrator, one of the worst things that I've seen is not only that these policies get put in place, but they're never audited, right? Why do we have a 7-year retention of SharePoint? I'm not saying I'm not questioning that, right? Why is our storage so expensive for Microsoft now? All right, well, we have a 7-year retention. Well, who said that? Who created this, right? Legal said that. Risk management said that. Compliance said that. It's not my policy. Configurations within 365 is you as an admin implementing the organization's policy. It is not you making a decision. And if you don't want to make that decision, You don't want to create this conditional access policy because, you're going to, it's already, it already is annoying that we have to deal with, and not trying to pick on executives here, but, I can imagine for companies that didn't force MFA before, and then all of a sudden you have MFA and it wasn't prepared, no one was prepared. And here comes this, senior leadership, executive leadership person who can't access their email. There's a lot to configuring this, because some of these things have a direct impact on the users, right? So we'll continue on that one, but know that you have, by all means, all the policies and the configurations that you have, and even the vendors that you have, everything should drive back to a policy. In this case, like for even Druva, your third-party applications that you're investing in that are hooked to your data, that have your data, you need to know, how are they going to deal if you had a compromise of an email? Not if Druva had the compromise, but if Microsoft, if your accounts were compromised and there was a valid account that had access to come in and delete snapshots, right? Deleting a snapshot is a feature that's been there. Backup admins want it for a reason. So that's a feature. So your SaaS applications that you have data going into, you need to ask them and ensure, what if we had this attack, what could be compromised of our data in your platform? How are we going to get that back? So, right, there's two things about we're a backup company first, and all of those
Hi,
snapshots.
Vanessa.
Yes.
Vanessa, I'm sorry to interrupt. We are running beyond the clock, and I would request you to close it by another 2 minutes, please.
Oh, I don't know why I thought I had. Well, maybe I've just taken up a lot longer than I thought. Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
I'll push forward. Okay.
right.
Let me see. Let me just push forward with this. So, let's talk about just exfiltration, right? Coming at encryptions and exfiltration, like the impact of our data. So the impact is what's happening. Okay, yes, with encryptions are exfiltrations, and that's on the rise. That becomes very important for you to understand from a recovery, from your incident response perspective. How are you going to deal with that, right? This particular gentleman actually went and proved out the remote encryption, right? How do we deal with, what is remote encryption? Because the path of encryptions that criminals have taken started off with, oh, encryption in place. Okay, I'm going to do, I'll take that data out, and that out is the first part. So it's either going to go out into your infrastructure because they've compromised, right, your network, or it's going to go out into theirs. They're going to encrypt it. They're going to put it back. So encryptions have really, they're changing. And that's where you're also going to see being right complex recovery points as part of your incident response. Because sometimes it's not about encrypting the data to take the data and know what's in the data, it's to lock you out. And if you think about what's in your data, right, in your sites that you've built these solutions, mergers and acquisitions, your legal contracts, you've migrated your company away from Ignite. I've done that so many times, and into 365, and use the workflows that are in there. I use it's great. You can do it. You can build these solutions. But now you've got time sensitive data in your data. That legal contracts, that contract must be submitted by next Monday. And if it's not, your lease for your organizations, for your buildings are at stake. I mean, that's like the reality of time sensitive data. So as these criminals are encrypting data, one of the things that they're doing to keep the small footprint is they're encrypting over time. So my OneDrive is not just automatically going to be encrypted, waving a flag, right? That might fire an alert. But so this is where you're having these small footprints. So the question for you then becomes, when you are involved in that incident response, you're part of, when could it, like finding these answers, when could it have started? Is it still happening? What are we dealing with? Because Microsoft has just told me now that there's a pairing that's on the rise of encryptions, And with encryptions comes exfiltrations. So you're going to have to know this is why being part of that incident response workflow or the incident response team is going to help you be prepared about finding the gaps. When we're talking about, I only have like 2 more slides and then I'll wrap it up here. Providing this answers and evidence, it's sometimes going to be down to a file level in these audits. You, whether you're on this team or not, are going to be tasked with, because you're associated to 365. How do we know what's been encrypted? What was in there before, right? And with that workflow, and depending on how you got there, most of the time, you're dealing with encryptions and being able to recover back to a prior point of time. So when you have that and you know what you're dealing with in all these solutions that you've built, and now I've got this prior point of time that my security team has said, this is my recovery point. All right, I now have 4 different versions of data that I would have lost for that time-sensitive data in the legal contract site. How are you going to deal with that? Right? You need to know what, I'll just close on this one, what you can do. Because you're now either going to be in the incident analysis, right? Are we dealing with an incident? Is it a false positive? Okay, now you're going to be possibly in the recovery, because the recovery, if you dealt with encryptions, all these encryptions, you can't just recover over it. You're going to have to make a decision on what you're going to do with all the encrypted data, right? Because it's just versions that are there. Can't just, are you going to restore over that and just leave those encrypted versions in that version history? Right? Or are you going to be able to say, and even at the end in that forensics and notifications, and I'll leave this is the slide, and the next one are my last slides, is that if Microsoft is telling us in the digital defense port, all these things are happening, they will continue to, right? They're on an increase. And here at the end of the day, we've been able to recover. That doesn't mean that it's stopped, that the response is stopped, right? That part of the responsibility of the team. Right? Now your risk management, they need to know exactly what was in there, right? Is there sensitive data? Is there PII? Right? The work continues. And even if you don't have a risk management team, but you have cyber insurance, they're going to ask you this type of information. So you need to go and find and know where the gaps are, where your data is concerned, so that you know what you have to push back on the organization, right? In terms of a response. So, all right, I'll leave it at that. Were there any questions are there any questions I can help answer here? No questions? Not even one question? I'm trying to get back to my Teams chat here. I think this is it.
All right. Vanessa, thank you so much for your time. I'm here stopping
Yes,
the
thank you.
recording. Yeah. Well, so we have